Hello, and welcome to the Cambridge PhDcasts. Now with me today is Alice Blackhurst, who's a PhD student at the Faculty of Modern and Medieval Languages, and she's going to be talking to us today about ideas and debates around luxury. So Alice, if you'd like to give us a bit of an introduction.
Sure. I'm always striving to be relevant, and I thought what could be more relevant amongst impoverished PhD students than a chat about luxury. Luxury, I suppose, is what I've been thinking about this past year. I'm in the first year of my PhD. I kind of just drawn to the idea of why we would even begin talking about luxury in a much proclaimed age of austerity, and also what it might mean to look at luxury in a digital kind of instant culture. Which puts so much focus on speed and on the quick turnover of information and on progress and on use value, which seems to contradict the whole premise of luxury as a slower mode of production and something that really depends on craft and attention and detail. And I'm just wondering whether, in regards to looking at literary texts and cultural artifacts or films, because I try and do interdisciplinary work, whether we've lost those kind of slower, kind of more appreciative, luxurious modes of cultural consumption. And also more generally, whether the process of making art could be seen as a luxurious occupation, really. So yeah, the perversity of talking about luxury, both as a PhD student and both in the kind of, in the social and political context in which we're in, kind of appeals to me. Embarking on a 3-year project, I kind of think, what's going to sustain my attention for
That's
3
a problem
years?
that a lot of us are very used to.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought, well, this is suitably confusing and a kind of controversial a topic to look at, really. But perversity aside, we are talking, I'm in the French department, so there'll be
an element of perversity.
There'll always be a bit of
I look forward to it.
Of perversity. Yeah, at first in Middle English in the 13th century, luxury was just a term to just communicate the act of sexual intercourse. Okay. So it was luxury, despite all the exciting connotations it has today, maybe, started off as having quite a descriptive kind of, the term had a descriptive and kind of literal function. And the French term luxure, which kind of popped up in the 14th century. I'm not really a linguistic historian, but around the 14th century kind of went one step further to convey the idea of lusting, and it was very bound up with the idea of lust and that transgressive kind of mode of lusting. So, and only then did the English term take on the connotations of lasciviousness and sinfulness and self-indulgence.
Inherited from the French.
Exactly. So that's what I find interesting, because we might expect the British kind of us British Puritans to have ascribed it that pejorative meaning, where it was actually kind of the moralizing aspect came from the French. So yeah,
that's a first.
Yeah, well, this is what I thought as well, and that that kind of tolerance and that permissiveness in regards to kind of sexual mores that we kind of we ascribe to the French is maybe kind of, does it have much ground? Maybe it's an illusion. Maybe we are kind of more tolerant than they are in that respect. And that just kind of got me thinking, why are we so invested in this idea of France as a luxurious nation, as one that kind of is invested in pleasure and sensuality and hedonism and where that idea comes from, I suppose. And I guess if you look at their kind of, and that mythology in France of flânerie, or that kind of idea of lingering and idling and kind of just aimlessly wandering around streets rather than kind of having any clear direction.
Sort of Anglo-Saxon A to B approach.
Exactly, and that corresponds to the idea of luxury as that which is just not interested in function per se, but is just more interested in reveling and in kind of in luxuriating. This idea of luxury being central to the French kind of like mode de vie, at the risk of sounding like one of those awful lifestyle books like How to Seduce like the French or something. And like if you look at Versailles, the architecture of luxury is very much kind of like central to like legitimating the power of the French state. The architecture of luxury is very central.
It's almost an enforced luxury at Versailles, where you bring the nobles together and you force them into these rituals.
Exactly, of opulence, and that being so central to the Ancien Régime, really. And even like pre-revolution, them saying, "Oh, we're going to get rid of all that pomp and all that cake eating and and what and what have you." Yet these kind of, in the revolution itself, that became a kind of luxuriating in violence and this kind of orgy of kind of blood shedding. And
I suppose a question that I wanted to ask, because I want to get on in a second to kind of wider debates around
luxury.
Yes,
of course, yeah.
But before we do that, I think one question is to what extent this, because if we have this notion of maybe the Puritan British shunning luxury and sumptuary laws in full force, as opposed to the French who are luxuriating in their flaneur and all these things. To what extent are these ideas, these kind of ways of imagining nations, to what extent do they just happen on a kind of Anglophone, Francophone axis? Or do the world share these? Or is this kind of linked to this little cross-channel feud?
That's interesting. I think globally we're invested in this idea of France as a kind of, it's almost this kind of mental escape we can check into in our minds. As it's like, it will always have Paris, that kind of
or the
idea.
year in Provence.
Exactly, that kind of exactly, that France will be there as somewhere where you can just kind of just escape the kind of like utilitarian kind of like mode of living and just kind of like focus on, eating and drinking,
going to the market with your string bag in the morning.
Exactly. So I don't know. I think it is a construction. Definitely, this idea of France, the luxurious nation. If you look at, I don't know, it's not as exciting or sexy to talk about like the history of French pragmatism or kind of like that. Or today, French philosophy seems to be kind of aligning itself much more with kind of sober and kind of classical kind of ideas of discipline and of rigor. So I think it is a construction, but one we're invested in for some reason. I think that's what's interesting, why we feel the need to maintain this idea of France. And also we love saying that they're just idle and they're like work shy.
It's a very helpful stereotype for people to draw on, I suppose.
Yeah, this is the thing.
So
that's the specific, I guess, that's the specific French context.
French, British, or certainly trying to export to the EU as well, which is interesting. Talking more widely about debates around luxury, because obviously this is a topic that's grabbed your attention. Where does, what's the state of debate around luxury today?
There have been so many attempts to make sense and to theorize luxury. I mean, starting really in the 18th century, the word really kind of took on like a kind of cultural clout, I suppose, but I don't really look there being a contemporary person. But I guess starting from Marx and his idea of like surplus value, and that being kind of a key way of judging the productivity of nations, but also this thing that had to be redistributed.
It takes on moral elements as well.
Definitely, I think so. I mean, I look at contemporary French culture, so I'm kind of interested in the wave of theories about luxury that came out of post-structuralism, kind of 60s to sort of 80s. I suppose you have people like Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist, who would see luxury as a kind of form of social exhibitionism, so a way for the privileged and the rich to parade their social kind of like superiority, and a way to kind of confirm that to others, and it being very much kind of linked to Veblen's idea of conspicuous consumption.
This idea of kind of performing and then confirming status.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly, and a behaviorist account kind of. then I suppose psychoanalytic accounts, which I don't really work on as much, would look at how the object transcends its use value to become something that we have a libidinal investments in, or kind of in.
This is back to the 14th century.
Yeah, back to the 14th century.
Yeah,
but then I suppose Deleuze, kind of, who I've looked at quite a lot, kind of sees luxury just as basically a correlative pleasure, and that like self kind of centered mode of seeking pleasure, which just returns one to a kind of very insular and very individualistic mode of being. And Deleuze is more about kind of, making connections and about rendering the self like imperceptible is his main kind of shtick. So he didn't like it either. Derrida is possibly the most accessible, and he just sees luxury as anything that is above need. So anything that kind of just transcends need, really. And so, but what I'm interested in is that all accounts of luxury thus far seem to have been understanding it as some kind of transcendent value, as that which kind of goes above and beyond. And no one yet has kind of really thought about luxury as a mode of resistance, and maybe a refusal to step up to certain functions, and a refusal to work, and to refusal to participate in that kind of capitalist matrix.
There's something I wanted to come to, because you just mentioned Derrida, and I know that Derrida has something to say about luxury, has something to say about coffee and cigarettes. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Always. Yeah, so he sort of sees coffee and cigarettes as kind of, I suppose, like them being kind of part of the architecture of French life, really, coffee and cigarettes, as kind of moments of luxury, kind of within the fabric of the everyday, really, and knowing that they are luxuries, and knowing that they are in some respects definitely bad for you, but being able to, but providing a moment, he talks of liberty and of kind of that moment of being able to escape one's own kind of sort of self-policing and sort of self-monitoring. And so he talks about coffee and cigarettes in terms of liberty and gratuity, really, but micro or sort of small acts of liberty and gratuity that's not going to overspill into kind of some kind of gross overdose of kind of excess and
he's obviously never met a PhD student near a deadline, but
that's true. Well, but the thing is, the French do seem to kind of take these things in a kind of quite disciplined way. I mean, they would never really binge on coffee like I would, or any PhD or exactly. So much to learn from them. But it's that idea of how we can incorporate small acts of luxury within a kind of within the kind of quotidien or everyday kind of context, and it's kind of, if you think about Bakhtin's idea of the carnival, which is that kind of, basically is that kind of subscription to the feast or the party as a much bigger moment of
it's when order gets kind of turned upside down,
and
there are these moments of license and of
exactly,
and of resistance as well,
and of resistance. But those are, rather than a complete turnover, it's the act of insidious resistance that Derrida and Deleuze as well would talk about, and that kind of moment of the small act of luxury.
I'll enjoy my coffee even more this afternoon.
Definitely.
I suppose then, coming from that, because we've heard so much about resistance and this idea, I mean, I'm fascinated by this idea that nipping outside for a smoke can be an act of subversion or something like this in some small way. So how, I mean, you mentioned earlier on this idea that maybe we can characterise luxury not just as immoral excess, but also maybe as some kind of resistance against a predominant culture.
So just moving away from this idea of luxury as wastefulness and as transcendence and as that necessary means of overstepping the kind of the mark. What if it was instead deliberate dysfunction, like an ethics of deliberate dysfunction and a refusal to work? There's been an exhibition in London recently, I've forgotten by who and I've forgotten the name, but they basically took luxury products manufactured in factories, like so shoes or like kind of designer shoes or cars, and then they would deliberately kind of take an aspect like the heel and kind of invert it or twist it. They were basically saying that true luxury shouldn't be about functionality in any way. It should be that which has no function and is just kind of this object of useless and kind of baffling beauty in a sense. I also think it's important to think about luxury, like we were talking, is this kind of slow mode of being, this kind of sort of savouring of the conditions one might happen to be in, as an antithesis to instant culture and this relentless drive for progress and this kind of constant need for information, and say, well, wait, what if we just kind of slow down here and kind of pause and it's a more kind of immanent way of being in the world.
It's kind of a deliberate inefficiency.
We've lost that sense, I think, of just doing things in an intransitive sense, like, so not looking towards what the final outcome might be, but just kind of sitting with things and kind of just doing them for the sake of
luxuriating.
Luxuriating. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at, that kind of luxuriating rather than just always progressing or doing or and I think
and that exists as a mode of resistance already. I mean, in the sense of, I think of things like the slow food movement, which says, we're going to deliberately step away from these industrialized models of food production. We're going to take time.
Well, because Ben Hameen says that, like citing a ridiculous amount of
fantastic
theorists, but that's just how I feel less lonely on a PhD by just having all these theorists as friends and imaginary friends. But says that the era of mechanical reproduction, which is, as sure you know, like just kind of that kind of factory, kind of capitalist, like industrialist mode, kind of inevitably weakens experience, and I'm saying that luxuriating might bring back that kind of appreciation of experience and might reintroduce some idea of experience, but also of value, because I think that if we're constantly moving from one thing to the next and we're constantly wanting to consume more or produce more, that kind of, and if everything is constantly available as well, that sense of value kind of flattens out a bit.
How does that impact on digital culture as well? Because I think you mentioned this earlier on.
Definitely. Well, I just think that digital culture is so in that information accumulating, but also truncating mode of compressing everything and making everything quick and easy and useful, and luxury and luxuriating could be a way of countering that, and in terms of literary reception of just paying close attention again and of kind of reading and slowly, because that's all things that doing a PhD kind of fosters. But I think that it's sad that kind of that quality of doing a PhD seems to be such a change of pace from the dominant digital culture in which we kind of increasingly find ourselves, which is about speeding up and condensing and
doing a million things at once.
Yes, exactly, and that's exactly and luxury as a single point of focus is so underrated. Really,
Gil Scott-Heron's last album came with instructions on how to listen to the album with it, which expressly forbade that you do anything else at the same time. And it told you it essentially was sitting in a darkened room with headphones.
That's so interesting.
And this notion that this is something that has to be expressly stated.
Yeah. Which is so, and I think that's what's happening, that texts are becoming increasingly like punctured by outside influences, that artists are like getting more neurotic about about control over their own text. And to some of them kind of maybe are embracing this kind of
I suppose more broadly then, what kind of materials do you draw on in doing this kind of research? Because you mentioned that art exhibition, and do you work, I mean, with film, I think you're working with as well?
Yes, I do. I mean, I'm not really working on that chapter right now, but I'm intending to look at kind of sensuous cinema, what might be a cinema of sensuality, and haptic materiality. The haptic, this is really like
you to draw that out
abstract, but the haptic comes from the Greek haptine, which means to touch, or also one etymological meaning of haptic is that which fastens onto something. So it's the idea of cinema that you kind of get so close to and you can almost touch it, and it's really that it's focusing on the kind of it's the intensity of the image in its full and kind of uninterrupted state. Does that make sense?
So how to experience something in the kind of in the greatest, most sensory way.
Yeah, and the greatest, most exactly, like the great. If you think of like extremely loud and incredibly close, that kind of it's kind of one of its manifestos.
White of the eyes.
Yeah.
Yes. No.
So that idea of just luxuriating in the filmic image might be one direction for the piece. But now I'm looking specifically at the idea of whether writing and literary production could be seen as work or as a luxury. And I'm looking at Annie Ernaux, who has a very kind of neurotic relationship, I think, too.
Tell us a bit more of it.
She's been writing in French, obviously, since kind of the 60s, 70s, and she's still alive and still working. But she writes a lot about class and about growing up in a kind of like lower middle class background and feeling kind of very anxious about this, and her experiences of moving up through the class system due to her education, really, and then becoming a teacher and then becoming a writer, and feeling sort of like intense really guilt at this kind of betrayal, she says, of her kind of like past milieu, really. And she constantly says, I know my writing life is a luxury, and she's like, and it's almost like she wants to kind of justify her own kind of chosen profession to herself and to the world she's left behind. So she's constantly saying, on the one hand, it's a luxury, but her style is very disciplined, very austere. This fetishizing of craft in a one way is to justify her writing as work. So there's just an interesting polarity between what she says and kind of what she does. There's a lot of I think it's very common in artists.
Well, it's so interesting to see the way, I think, that that art and the creation of art is still so bound up in these moral questions, and whether it's luxury and whether it's permissible.
Exactly.
If you want to maybe, tell us a bit more about, because the creation of art is it always luxury, but also, I suppose the question jumping from that is, and talking about resistance, is that necessarily something immoral? Is going into a basement and spending 4 years writing a book, is it something?
Well, I just think that we should kind of shake off these moralizing categories. I mean, I'm not quite sure why they have persisted so much. I suppose because writing a book is not really going to save the world in any like direct sense, is it really? And we are narrative animals, and we do tell ourselves stories, I think, in order to really live, and they're so essential to our survival and as human beings. But in some sense, thinking and writing and all of these things associated, or just all of these activities associated with making art are not values that really can be kind of compressed within a market economy, and they're somehow threatening in that sense. So they need to be kind of curtailed and understood as kind of, aberrations in some way.
Well, which is, I suppose, I mean, a really, a serious topic. You'd say, questions of austerity, of funding for the arts, and even more broadly, of funding for academia as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
And this is something we talked about this briefly before the recording, and I asked Twitter whether it thought that doing a PhD was a luxury, and checked my responses just before we came on. We have an overwhelming yes from academics and non-academics alike. But I suppose maybe now is the time to probe that a little bit more and to say, given that you've complicated our notion of what luxury is, what's your idea there?
Yeah, I think it's quite hard to argue for a PhD not being a luxury in some sense. I think it's important, and I think it's valuable, and I think, like I've been saying throughout this whole chat, I don't think we always have to do things that have specific kind of, that are means to an end in a certain sense. And a PhD buys you really so much time. And space and a single point of focus, and you're never going to be as unharried and kind of
it's that freedom.
Yeah, exactly. But then if you say that doing a PhD on kind of a very niche aspect of French culture is a luxury, then you're kind of, I wonder whether you're kind of confirming this kind of increasing marketization of the university, where things are having to become more and more vocational, and where the job market looms ever larger over the kind of the university and what it does. It's an uncomfortable question.
A question of utility as well.
Yes, exactly. Because increasingly now doing a PhD, you don't really just have 3 years in a vacuum. The whole time you have to be thinking, what am I going to do next? And have I got the skills to go forward with a job in academia? It's kind of, it's that I think we like to think that a PhD can transcend the kind of market kind of demands, but it's still a commodity in some sense too.
That's increasingly the ground, I think, for that debate, is the question of whether is a PhD useful, but also does it need to be?
Yes, exactly. And I don't think it should really need to be useful. I guess it always comes back to you have to contribute to knowledge. That's terrifying, kind of your PhD must contribute to knowledge.
An original contribution.
Yes, exactly. But if you think about add to knowledge, contribute to knowledge, that's still being evoked in terms of a supplement, kind of an add-on, or a luxury in terms of that you're not going to... you're just adding, but that sharing and that participating and that accumulation is important.
This is it. I think it's ever more important as we kind of work to create a defence of.
Exactly. There was something I wanted to say though. Yeah, that doing a PhD, yes, it's hard to hear, but it's such a luxury thrown at you all the time, when actually it can be really difficult and really not that I'm kind of, I definitely don't think it's the most difficult thing you could do with your life.
I'd rather it than a day down the mines myself.
Yeah, this is the thing, and I think luxury has uncomfortable connotations of elitism and privilege, and so it's kind of, it's easier to be yes, it is a luxury, and kind of be and then bow one's head. The conversation shouldn't end there.
I guess it's by you're kind of problematizing what luxury is.
Yeah, exactly.
And it makes me think there's the comedian Stuart Lee has this great story about Margaret Thatcher visiting an Oxford college in the 1980s, and being shown around by a young student and asking him what he does, and he says, "Well, I'm studying, I think it's Anglo-Saxon studies." And she replies, "Oh, what a luxury that is." And
said by the woman who had a penchant for Dior handbags.
They're lovely handbags. But I think it's interesting to think that what your research and what this discussion is doing is to say, well, we can accept that something is a luxury, but we can find new political and even subversive values within that.
So. Yes, it's a privilege, but what do we do with that privilege? And I'm thinking of Girls, Lena Dunham's HBO show. Which really does kind of look at that idea of being very privileged and being very comfortable to some extent, but also seeing that as something, as just giving you lots of choices that you have to kind of, that are great, but also can be slightly just difficult to it can be difficult to find one's position within that privilege, if that makes sense.
A whole new moral landscape.
Fascinating.
So, two categories we keep coming back to. So we keep coming back to, obviously, the idea of luxury, but also the idea of need. And it strikes me that these are obviously massively politicised. When we talk about necessity, and necessity is constantly under debate, what you need as opposed to what is simply...
And so dictated to by kind of media and
media and government as well. So I suppose where... in all of this research and discussion, where does the politics of luxury come in?
I mean, it's not something I like to think about too much, being a literature student. But,
it's hard to get away from the politics.
It is hard to. It really is. I think, the politics of luxury. It's hard to say yes, we should revel in surplus and celebrate excess when really there are many that just don't have enough, really, and so that already becomes quite difficult to justify, really, and this idea that why is there surplus when it could be redistributed, and surplus should become channeled into more kind of socialist kind of ideas of the state and ideas of on wealth and wealth kind of partitioning. I find that a tricky obstacle in my research, how to sort of stand up for luxury and excess from that perspective. I suppose the question is, though, who, and one that I'm still working out, who decides what's luxurious and who decides what's necessary, and is it the government or is it kind of more is it more kind of ground level, that it's sort of, if we say that the arts and academia are luxurious, then this kind of sort of this maintains kind of the sort of separation and division of labour in society in a way that we're comfortable with, in a way that we can sort of... Does that make sense?
Well, it seems to be almost you're pulling the idea of luxury away from it being attached very strictly to commodities. If that makes sense. So what you said about moving it away from a kind of market system, if that means
No, definitely. I mean, even though that's kind of impossible in some sense, and we're always going to be contained within that market system, it's more about how we can make space within that market system.
How can you luxuriate in work or in practice?
That's a really interesting way of putting it. So I'm not 100% comfortable with the politics of luxury, really, and it's something that I'm still trying to figure out, really. But I guess I started off by looking at how luxury could be deployed from the perspective of arts criticism and literary criticism specifically, but then that idea of art being a luxury is so politicized, and does it come from artists kind of shame and guilt, like we were talking about, and you have at intrinsically knowing that what they're doing is kind of quite nice compared to what a lot of things that we similarly categorize as work, and whether art can be work, and whether if it's work that kind of goes against the whole premise of art as that which is unworking our received ideas of society and our kind of way of being in the world. So it's hard.
It poses some pretty challenging political ideas.
It's hard.
It is.
So
Well, it's a PhD.
it's why it's a PhD.
I know that you wanted to. You mentioned that you might finish on a poem which you've brought in for us. Would you like to maybe give us a bit of background? And read that.
So this is a poem by the American poet Sharon Olds from the collection Stag's Leap, which came out in 2012, just before the new year, and it's kind of asking the question of what luxury might be in the aftermath of 9/11, as the title September 2001 New York City immediately suggests. But it's also against that universal backdrop, talking about the poet's relation to her mother and her mother's death. So I'll read it.
Thank you.
A week later, I said to a friend, I don't think I could ever write about it. Maybe in a year I could write something. There is something in me, maybe someday, to be written. Now it is folded and folded and folded, like a note in school. And in my dream, someone was playing jacks, and in the air there was a huge, thrown, tilted jack on fire. And when I woke up, I found myself counting the days since I had last seen my husband. Only 2 years, and some weeks, and hours. We had signed the papers and come down to the ground floor of the Chrysler building, the intact beauty of its lobby around us like a king's tomb, on the ceiling the little painted plane, in the mural, flying. And it entered my strictured heart this morning, slightly, shyly, as if warily, untamed, a greater sense of the sweetness and plenty of his ongoing life, unknown to me, unseen by me, unheard, untouched but known, seen, heard, touched. And it came to me for moments at a time, moment after moment, to be glad for him that he is with the one he feels was meant for him. And I thought of my mother, minutes from her death, 85 years from her birth, the almost warbler bones of her shoulder under my hand, the eggshell skull, as she lay in some peace in the clean sheets, and I could tell her the best of my poor, partial love. I could sing her out with it. I saw the luck and luxury of that hour.
That's absolutely fantastic, and it brings together, I think, so much of what you've been saying about the question of art and luxury and what the storytelling means in the context of all of that.
Exactly.
And I think, well, it really does. And then I think as we prepare to maybe have a cup of coffee and then go out and tweet in 140 characters about what we've done, I think there's a huge amount to think about what luxury means in an age of austerity, an age of digitization. So
and what happens to storytelling?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So
thank
hope we
you.
find out. So thank you so much, Alice.
Oh no, thanks.
Thanks for listening to this Cambridge PhDcast, presented by me, John Gallagher, and produced by Richard Blakemore and Ruth Rushworth, and produced in association with CRASSH. If you'd like to hear more from us and for our fantastic collection of PhDcasters, please visit the CRASSH website at crash, that's with 2 S's, .cam.ac.uk. Thank you for listening.